Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Social Impact Solutions podcast. Today, John Mark and I are really excited to talk about impact measurement and impact communication. So, you may have heard us talk about one or both of these topics in the past, but typically we have separated them out. We've talked about impact measurement in one podcast or one webinar, and then we'll talk about impact communication in another podcast or webinar or virtual event or panel, whatever format it might be. But today we really wanted to talk about both impact measurement and impact communication. They obviously go hand in hand. We know that, you know that. But what we're finding is that a lot of people, particularly nonprofit leaders, get really excited about communicating their impact. When we talk about impact communication, people get excited. They're like, oh, yes, we want to do that. We need to do that. We aren't doing that well. And the reality is, if you're not measuring your impact, then it's really hard, likely impossible, to adequately or effectively communicate your impact. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Which one you should focus on first, impact measurement or impact communication. And John Mark has some statistics to share with us to kick us off, and then we'll dive into the specifics of how you can figure out and determine what your organization needs to focus on first.
Absolutely. Lauren, thanks so much for the introduction. I think that's awesome. Before we get too far, let's talk about what we mean by impact. Obviously, we're social impact solutions. We focus a lot on impact. This is the bread and butter that we live and work in. And so when we talk about impact, we're really talking about the change that your programs create over time. Impact is one of those buzzwords that gets used and abused. Impact is put into so many different contexts. It would take all day to list them all out. But for social impact, for the difference that your organization creates, it really is talking almost exclusively, not every single time, but almost every single time, on the change that your programs create over time. And that time part is really important because you can look at what change did we create in a 1 month timeline. We can look at a 6 month timeline. We can look at a year. The conversation gets a lot more interesting when we start tracking like more than 3 years or more than 5 years. In some instances, you're looking at 20-year changes to be able to really track impact over that kind of time horizon. A great example of that would be early childhood education, right? Early childhood education, the impact doesn't really pay off until those children have grown into adults. That's when you start to see the actual change that is created as a result of early childhood education. So you're looking like a 20-year timeline with early childhood. And so that's what we're talking about when it comes to impact. It's the change that your programs create over time. But we like to do a little bit of surveying here over at Social Impact Solutions. And we've surveyed around a little bit over 1,200 nonprofit leaders. And these are nonprofits of all sizes, all shapes, sizes, mostly in the United States, but not exclusively in the United States. And we found that 46% of the nonprofit leaders that we surveyed said that they really don't have impact data to speak of. That means they do not have a theory of change. They do not have logic models. They do not have measurable goals and objectives. They're not tracking outcomes, or they're not tracking the actual impact metrics that matter most. And there's a lot that I just mentioned there. And those are essentially like just the different layers of impact measurement. But 46% of the nonprofit leaders that we surveyed said they do not have sufficient impact data. 6% of nonprofit leaders stated that they struggle to communicate their impact to funders. It's not terribly surprising when there's not any impact data to begin with, like what Lauren was saying earlier. And so, Lauren, when you see 46% do not have impact data, 56% struggle to communicate impact, where does your mind go? What are your thoughts on those two statistics?
Yeah, I think it's really surprising in some ways, and I think expected in others. When we talk to as many nonprofit leaders or other consultants in the industry, granting organizations, foundations, when we are talking to all of those stakeholders in the industry, I think that everyone knows that most nonprofits don't have adequate impact data. Most nonprofits have, at best, output numbers. So the number of people in their programs or the number of supplies they distribute, the number of courses that they provide or services that they provide. So that's known and consistent for most people that we talk to and interface with. While at the same time, from a little bit more of a research perspective and a program evaluation perspective, it is surprising that organizations receive adequate funding or can receive adequate funding without really measuring the true change that they're creating. But we
That's a good.
also know that, yeah, but we also know that that funding tends to dissipate over, after a year or two or three of giving. And a lot of times, not always, but oftentimes that's because the funder, again, whether that money is coming from a grant or an individual donor or a corporate partner, we see this all the time, that any funder type wants to see the impact that they're helping you create. And when nonprofits can't report that back to the funder, then they're less likely to secure those donations, whether that's a first time donation or an annual or monthly recurring donation. And so, in some ways, I would say it's surprising just from the standpoint of how and why? Why are nonprofits not measuring their impact more, just simply from the standpoint of wanting to improve programs for the people you serve or the community that you serve? While at the same time, we know that resources are limited and it can feel overwhelming and challenging and like a huge time constraint to capture adequate inputs and outputs and data, analyze that data, and then report it back to funders, volunteers, and other stakeholders. So, simply put, in some ways it's surprising, and in other ways, I think it's very much expected.
I think it's a great point. That's a great point. So for all of you who are listening and may not know this, Lauren has a doctorate in public health, a master's in nutrition. She's published, I don't know how many articles at this point in scholarly journals. She understands the ins and outs of what it takes to start measuring social impact and doing that in a way where you can then apply for substantial funding, right? But you want to do it in a way that's actually rigorous and legitimate using validated tools. And so I love every opportunity I get to brag on Lauren and talk about her credentials and why she's so qualified to do what she does. But just thinking, where do you focus your attention, right? Nonprofits solve a lot of problems. They deal with lots of issues, but we all have limited resources. Despite the size of the organization, everyone has limited resources. And so Lauren came up with this great question that I think is really good for how do we best allocate our resources today? Where do we focus today and maybe this quarter, right? This month, this quarter, maybe the half of this year, because we have to measure, we have to communicate. Those two things have to happen if we want to increase funding, if we want to solve big, hairy problems that only nonprofits can solve. And so here's the critical question that Lauren came up with. Critical question is, can you confidently show using data that your program made a measurable difference in your community from beginning to end? And depending on how you answer that question, you double down on, if the answer is no, I need to start measuring my impact more effectively. If the answer is yes, it's time to get to work and start communicating that, right? And we can talk about different strategies for both. But Lauren, why don't you just talk a little bit about that critical question, that you came up with and why you think it's so important?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. If people that are listening are like me, I'm much more visual. And so hearing it a second time is just helpful for me personally, even though I came up with it. But the critical question that we're asking today is, can you prove or can you show with data that your program or programs have made a measurable difference from beginning to end? So in other words, do you have pre and post program information or data that shows that if you're focused on education, does it show how your program is improving or increasing student self efficacy? Does it show or measure that students have better grades this school year because of your program? Does it show that over a 9-month timeline, a 12-month timeline, a 24-month timeline, that graduation rates have started to improve? So I'm picking on an education focused organization. So that's what we mean by, being able to measure and actually knowing the change that your programs are creating. A lot of nonprofit executive directors or program directors or even development officers, lots of people that we talk to within nonprofits, they'll say, well, we know that our programs are creating change. We know that. We just don't have the data to prove it. And they might actually know that, but it also might be a very subjective perspective. And so that's why the impact measurement piece is so critically important, because when you are part of the organization, you do have biases. We all have biases. And that's okay. That's part of being human. But measuring this information is really important so that you can say, Oh, well, this aspect of our program that we thought was the most key critical part of what we do, it's actually not being all that helpful. Like it has a neutral response or a neutral effect. It's not harmful, but it's not helpful. We thought this was what the community needed, but in fact, that's not the case. Similar to that, you might find that a small piece of your program that wasn't a true focal point is actually being much more effective and impactful for the community you serve. And so, with those insights, you might start to shift and modify how you conduct your programs depending on what you find. So, truly, the most important piece of impact measurement is really determining how effectively are you serving your community. And a lot of times I say the people that you serve. I understand that animal shelters, humane societies, environmental groups, policy and advocacy groups. Maybe you aren't directly serving humans, but in reality, we're all affecting communities that are made up by people. And so the community that you serve, the people that you serve, no matter what type of organization you are, really determining where people are at, where your community is at, or if you're an animal shelter, where your puppies, your cats, sea turtles, whatever you're taking care of. What's their problem? Where are they at baseline before they start your program? And then how do they progress? Whether you have a 2-week program, a 2-month program, a 2-year program, where are they at as they go through your program? And certainly by the time they quote unquote graduate from your program, how has their life changed? What difference is being created? And sometimes that's easier to measure than others, but measuring it nonetheless, ideally through validated assessment tools like John Mark mentioned, is really critical. And that's what funders want to see, right? They don't want to subjectively hear that, well, we know that our programs are helping our community. We just don't have any data to prove that, or we don't really have much other than a couple of stories to back that up. That's not going to get very far. It might convince a couple of funders who feel really passionate about your mission, but it will probably only convince them to give one gift, a couple of gifts over the course of a year or but if you want to get really serious about growing your organization, for a variety of reasons, you have to absolutely be able to measure and report on the real change that's taking place.
Excellent points. Excellent points all across the board. And so for those of you who answered yes or no, we like to use this analogy, right? We just call it the bicycle analogy. And so just obviously this is a podcast, so visualize with us just for a little minute. Think about those old-timey bicycles, right? Where they had a little bitty wheel on the front or the back and this massive wheel. So it's just sort of this very lopsided, bicycle being the point. And in social impact solutions, like we talk about the front wheel being the impact, right? It is steering the organization in the direction of where the greatest impact can be created. And the back wheel is the funding engine, right? It's the funding wheel. And so it's how effectively you attract, convert, and retain ideal donors. And we could talk about that on a different conversation, but just thinking, where do we want to allocate resources? But saying for impact measurement, we need to know where you are today. We've got to capture baseline. And we see a lot of organizations that are very lopsided, right? There are very, very small, teeny tiny organizations that do a marvelous job of measuring their impact. I mean, a truly marvelous job. They might bring in $50,000 a year, but they do a fantastic job of measuring their impact. On the flip side, we see enormous nonprofits, right? Massive, massive nonprofits that are barely measuring anything beyond an output, right? If they're doing that and they're not doing it in real time, and it's due to data maturity, it's due to practice, but both sides have issues, right? Trust me, one is not better than the other. It's a lot easier to have a ton of cash, but what I can tell you is that those large organizations are losing funding so quickly because funders have become so much more sophisticated. And they're like, listen, what difference is my money making? These stories that you're telling me and these output numbers aren't getting it done anymore. I need to know what difference is the money making. And so they're different challenges, but they're just different problems to solve at different points in time, right? But you can't solve both effectively at the same time. You really want to attack one while maintaining the other. And then once you've solved that one, you then improve the other. And so organizations that, let's just say, struggle to measure their impact, Lauren, like what do you see is commonplace if they have a really small front wheel, like where their steering wheel is, what's typical for an organization, despite their size, when they struggle with impact measurement? What does that usually look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see a variety of different reasons with the clients that we work with, that you and I and our team work with. But I would say more often than not, so not 100% of the time, but more often than not, it really is a conversation around systems, processes, and more of an operational component. So I'm not pointing fingers at any specific department. But a lot of times, impact or impact data is not being captured and reported on because of the way that programs are functioning. And so maybe an organization has a post-program survey. A lot of times we have nonprofits that say, well, we have impact data. And I know we've already said this, but by that, they mean we can tell you how many people are in our programs. We can tell you how many website visitors we have. We can tell you, some of our donor data or our marketing data. All of that's really important, but that is just not what we mean when we're talking about impact data. Like John Mark said earlier, measuring change over time, specifically the change that your programs are creating, is what we're talking about when we talk about the outcomes and the impact that your programs and your organization are creating. So if an organization has a survey that they send out, oftentimes they're only sending that out after the program is over. The problem with that is you don't have anything to compare it to, right? So where were these people at baseline pre-program? Again, I say people, most of the time we're dealing with health and human services organizations, but this can be done for all types of organizations. Another issue that we see is not just that it's only a post-program survey, but it's also oftentimes a survey that is created by someone within the organization itself. So again, a lot of subjectivity, a lot of bias from the survey creation and therefore the survey answer side. That's why we like to use validated assessment tools in the research world. When you're trying to get something published, hardly ever could you get away with just randomly developing your own survey questions and then taking the results of that survey. You have to use something that's been validated by other sources. It sounds sophisticated. The process of validating surveys is complex and it takes a lot of time. But once they're validated and they're out in the world, you just go choose something that works well for your organization and for your programs. So there are all sorts of validated surveys, assessments, quizzes, tests, call it whatever you want to, but universities, healthcare systems, consulting groups, there are lots of different groups in the US and internationally that create really sound measurement tools that likely align with something that your organization does. If you're helping individuals with disabilities, there are countless validated assessment tools for you. If you're helping individuals improve their job training and job availability to go out and get better jobs, there are, again, endless assessment tools. So those are the two things I think that we see most often is either there's absolutely zero program data being captured at all, or if there is some data being captured from programs, it's typically just happening at the end of the program and there's nothing to compare it to. And then again, the questions that are being asked, the surveys that are being used are not very sound at all, giving you very skewed insights. And a lot of times those survey questions aren't aligned with goals, objectives. They're more so just asking for participant feedback. Like, did you like this program? How can we improve it? That's really important. And I absolutely encourage people to get feedback from program participants, but you have to also measure, what are you changing for them? So not just asking for a testimonial at the end, but really doing like a knowledge assessment or a skills assessment or a self-efficacy assessment or attitudes and behaviors. There's all sorts of things that we can measure what's really changing. And you have to make sure that that's aligned with your program goals and objectives before you start asking all these questions and distributing the surveys. So I would say those are some of the things that we see as barriers or challenges to organizations not having adequate impact data.
It's a great point. Just great points all around. And let me just, for everyone who's listening, like, it's gotten so much easier to do this. When we first started, and honestly, even before we started doing this as entrepreneurs, as like what we started as a company, it used to be really hard, right? Just really, really hard because the software didn't exist, right? The processes were very manual, but we live in an amazing time right now to where organizations of all sizes have access to remarkable resources, remarkable training to be able to do this, which is again why we started Social Impact Solutions in the first place, to help organizations measure and communicate their social impact so they can raise more money and obviously do more good. We're really interested in you scaling your programs. And we know that's really costly. It costs a lot of money to scale programs, which I think is a good segue into the impact communication side. And so if you do measure your impact effectively, fantastic. Kudos to you and your team for making that a reality. What we want to do now is talk about communicating that impact. I think it's really important to talk about what is the most effective way to communicate impact. And if we're going to talk about this from a fundraising perspective, I don't think there's anything that's more efficient than communicating impact to ideal donors. We talk about ideal donors all of the time at Social Impact Solutions. And I want to let you know why. It's not because it's our opinion, not because we came up with this idea of ideal donors. It's been around for decades. It's that organizations that are able to scale, that are able to grow very fast and to do like to actual real enterprise level size. So let's talk about $50 million a year in funding. 90+% of organizations that achieve that result do so by focusing on one funder type. I'm going to say it again. They scale like that's that quickly into that size by focusing on one funder type. That
Mhm.
means if you are an organization that is excellent at writing, winning, and reporting on grants from family foundations, and if that's the lion's share of where your revenue comes from, the best advice out there is to write more grants, win more grants, and report on more grants. And like this, the idea that we need to diversify by funder type is not sound advice for organizations that are trying to scale. It is good advice for organizations that are not trying to shrink, if that makes sense, because the idea of diversification comes from the investing world. It comes from financial planners, which are awesome. I don't say anything negative about financial planners. But the number one job of financial planners is for you to not lose your money. That's what they're trying to do. They are trying to not lose money. So it's a very much a risk conversation. When we're talking about growth, we need to talk less about diversification and more on concentration. And there's so many nonprofits that are spread extraordinarily thin because they're writing some grants over here and they're doing a peer-to-peer campaign over here. And over here, they're trying to pull off a gala. And over here, they're trying to pull off what's another good example? Pickleball tournaments, right? Oh, we're going to start doing community-wide pickleball tournaments. We see this. And they've got 5 different funding channels and they do $350,000 a year. And it's like, you can't grow that way. It's too expensive, right? And it really does reduce down to the dollars and cents. And so, Lauren, let's talk more about ways of communicating impact. But I think it's always important to remind people, if you're serious about growth, and if you're not, it's totally fine. But for those of you who are serious about growth and serious about solving that big, hairy, audacious problem that your organization solves, you want to focus your efforts on the people that can move the needle most, the people or funders, the funding institutions. Those can be ideal funders. It doesn't have to be an individual that's, an individual donor. It can be a family foundation, a corporate foundation. It can be a federal grant. It can be all sorts of things. But that's the most effective way to grow your fundraising. Lauren, what would you say are most effective ways in communicating the impact to funders like that?
Yeah, I think just John Mark just shared a lot of really, really valuable components. And so people are probably like, talk more about that. So I would like to encourage people to look out for our next episode because we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about ideal funders, not just ideal donors. When we say ideal donors, a lot of people think just individual donors. In our next episode, we'll talk a lot about ideal funders and unpack this idea that John Mark is mentioning. This isn't our opinion. This is very, very founded by some of the best in the nonprofit consulting industry. So stay tuned for more on determining who your ideal funders are. how you can go find more of them, where you can go find more of them. But circling back to really the point of today's conversation, communicating your impact to those ideal funders. John Mark, there's not just one best way to communicate impact. Ideally, these nonprofit leaders that are listening know who their ideal funders are, and then that's how you determine what's most effective from an impact communication standpoint.
Mm,
If grants and foundations are your ideal funder type, if they're making up the majority of your annual revenue, then we would absolutely encourage go get more funding from grants and foundations. And that likely means that you need to have a really solid theory of change, a really solid logic model, really solid goals and objectives specifically for your programs, not just for your organization. And your goals and objectives need to align with your theory of change and logic model. And then you need to show in your grant application, you need to make it really clear how you're tracking the progress towards your goals and objectives, how you're measuring your data, how you're reporting your data. That's going to be most important and compelling to grants and foundations most of the time. And then a lot of times you're having to report back to them, right? You have to give them quarterly or annual reports to say, not only is this what we did with your funding, but here are the results that we saw with it. Here are the results that we saw with our programs. So that's going to be really critical from a measurement and communication piece with receiving grant funding. If you're talking about corporate sponsorships, corporate partnerships, then we get into more of, the CSR, corporate social responsibility, and really finding aligned values, right? Aligned values with individual donors, but absolutely with corporate partners as well. And helping corporate partners really see how their partnership, their sponsorship is creating an impact. Also helping them see how they can get their employees involved, maybe as volunteers or also as donors with your organization. So effective communication tools there might be brochures, flyers, things that a corporation or a business is actually distributing throughout if they're in office, if they have a physical location, if they're a remote team, then finding ways to maybe, not just email, but maybe get in their Slack channel or various ways to communicate effectively. And then
mhm.
with individual donors, that's probably where I don't know if I would say it's easiest, but I think it can be easiest to communicate impact to individual donors. And email is still one of the most effective ways to communicate with individual donors. A lot
Absolutely.
of people don't believe that. A lot of nonprofits don't communicate with donors through email very often. However, email is still one of the most effective ways to communicate, and weekly email is really fantastic. Most nonprofits don't do that. Most nonprofits send out a monthly or a quarterly email to donors. Bandwidth is a problem, resources, personnel. I know that that's limited for a lot of organizations, but communicating with donors more than once a month and more than once a quarter is really critical. So including impact metrics, impact stories into your email campaigns for individual donors is a very, very effective approach. So I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, because I know that there's lots of impact communication strategies and tools that I didn't mention. So would love to hear your thoughts as well, John Mark.
I think those are great. I mean, if people that are listening do half of these things and they do them effectively, now obviously creating impact reports and updating people on the stories of transformation that are occurring, people looking at the outputs and the outcomes of your programs. But if you want to get exciting, you'll make things really, really interesting. Let's bring your accounting team into the conversation, right? Let's bring programs and let's bring accounting, marketing, and development all into the same conversation. Let's do a little bit of math, right? These are not complicated calculations, but what are our dollar per outputs, right? What are our dollar per outcomes if we're measuring outcomes? And I hope that we are. But just thinking, okay, great, we served 10,000 people. Okay, well, what was the budget? Let's say it's 10,000 people over the course of a year. We spent $100,000. Okay, $100,000 divided by 10,000. It's $10 per output. Depending on what we're talking about, that could be a very interesting metric, right? And so just thinking, these are really efficiency ratios, just for people that are wondering, because evaluators, funders, like what we're all trying to do is like we're trying to look, where can money be best spent? Like you think about your nonprofit. If you were going to go pitch your nonprofit on Shark Tank, you would need to answer these kinds of questions. Okay, great. So what's the math behind it? What are your efficiency ratios here? Funders want to know this information. And what's interesting and exciting is that it's funders of all types now. It's not just federal funders, it's not just foundation funders, it's individuals. And so if we can start to talk about dollar per output and dollar per outcome, that's a really exciting conversation. It's like we can eradicate poverty in our area for $5 million. Okay, interesting. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the social return on investment too, of what that will do economically for this region. And y'all might think this is pie in the sky conversation. This is the world of impact evaluation, right? Like this is the world that exists. Folks like Lauren with doctorates in public health and folks that are economic analysts, like this is the work that, companies like ours do so that funders can make informed decisions, so that nonprofit leaders can make informed decisions with how they want to scale their programs. Now, when you look at maternal and child health from a social return on investment, on average, it's a $15 return for every $1 invested. That's amazing, right? That's truly amazing. A 15x return. And so this stuff has sort of been in the realm of soft science fluffy for so long. It's been perceived that way. And it's simply not. It's rigorous, it's important, it is very much in the realm of hard science and evaluation. And it's a really exciting conversation too, because this is how we create meaningful change. We just need to communicate that change as effectively as we can. And that's why we love the company that we started. That's why we love having this podcast and why we love getting to work with wonderful nonprofit leaders like you. I hope that this has been a helpful conversation for everyone who's listening.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, John Mark. I think there's so much that we can continue to unpack in future conversations. But like I said earlier, would love for people to stay tuned for our next episode that is more on ideal funders and how nonprofits can figure out who their ideal funders are specifically for their organization. And then I also think it would be a lot of fun to have a future conversation that's more around impact investing, social return on investment, and some of the things that you just talked about in that last little bit here. So there's always so much to talk about, while at the same time we try to keep our episodes a little bit shorter for people to listen to in a single setting. But thank you all so much for listening. John Mark, thank you for your contributions and everything that you added today. And we're excited to see you in the next episode.
Awesome. Thank you so much.